Welcome to the first edition of Cooler Heads Prevail. Now, we're kind of new at this, so we decided to start off with a nice, easy one, climate change. We'll get that taken care of in no time.
Yeah.
So anyway, just to give everybody a little bit of a background, we put together a set of questions that we're going to ask each other, and we're going to answer them as best we can. And then in the final segment, we're going to see if we can come to an agreement about what we can do about the current situation. So, Jim, you won the coin toss, so you're up first.
All right. The first question is, do you believe global warming is caused by the increase in CO2 levels in the atmosphere?
I think it's a perfectly reasonable conclusion to make. What might still be at issue is exactly how much of an impact the increased CO2 is having.
Do you believe that man is responsible for the great majority of the CO2 increase in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution?
That's also very reasonable to say. Sure. I mean, we're burning a lot of fossil fuels right now, and the exhaust, since we have nowhere else to put it, has been going right into the air. So anyway, what is the one piece of evidence that told you that CO2 was the main culprit?
Well, watching Inconvenient Truth was something that I did as a refresher,
Mm-hmm.
but the one piece of evidence that comes out of that and that shows very clearly is the graph that Al Gore puts up there that shows the increase in CO2 and the corresponding increase in temperature over 400,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the scary part is that CO2 has not been this high since in the last 400,000 years and more, has not been this high. And right now it's about 30%, 33% higher than it has been during that time. That's scary.
Yeah, and I will say this: when you watch that movie and he puts that big graph up on the screen, it's certainly very compelling. And this is the part where I might get some people angry at me. Some have pointed out,
hmm
and before you jump on this, hear me out, that a closer inspection of the data shows that the CO2 levels often did not rise until hundreds of years after global temperatures rose. And don't get me wrong, I respect Neil deGrasse Tyson so much. I absolutely loved it when he brought back Cosmos. But this is an example of a finding that needs a response from a public figure like Dr. Tyson. Simply dismissing it as cherry picking the data is not the way to win people over.
But what would you say then is causing the increase in heat in the Earth if it isn't the CO2?
The variations in the Earth's orbit, sunspot activity. Um,
Has any scientist that you know of ever come up with a correlation between anything except the greenhouse gases and CO2 being the prime one?
this is where I'm going with that. Um, if you look at Inconvenient Truth and Inconvenient Sequel back to back, you'll find that there's very little difference in tone to the two movies. There's very little difference in the way the evidence is presented in both of the two films. And with this constant back and forth that we've had for all this time, with the burden of proof being on them, it kind of surprises me that no one's raised a hand to say, well, maybe we should change up our strategy a little bit.
Another question I have is why does it seem to be that it's mostly Republicans don't believe that man-made climate change is real? What's the motivation or what's the rationale or reasoning or logic behind not believing that climate change is real and that it's man-made when the evidence is so overwhelming, so compelling? And are they even on average? You can't speak for every Republican, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
but do they even understand the science? Do they care about the science? Are they looking at that? Are they actually arguing points
Mm-hmm.
about blips in the data or a possible other explanation? Or they're just like, I don't believe it. I mean, what is the argument that it isn't man-made activity that's causing the greenhouse gases, the CO2, to increase? Therefore, the increase in the temperatures and instability in the climate.
I think that touches on one area that I wanted to talk about with you today. where if you have an issue of this importance, and this actually goes back to the point I made just a moment ago, where the people that are forwarding this idea need to rethink their strategy a little bit, is to understand that there are Republicans out there that do believe the pollution caused by the burning of petroleum, coal, oil, fossil fuels is presenting a large problem. And one of those people actually happens to be the mayor of Georgetown, Texas, who, as it so happens, Al Gore went to visit at the end of Inconvenient Sequel. And he's a self described conservative Republican, and he proudly announced the fact that his community is fully dependent on renewable energy. And personally, I think that's great. And the reason why I say that is because I think it's definitely within our interest to widen our energy portfolio as best we can.
Well, and as it becomes more and more cost effective,
Oh, yeah.
why not?
Yeah.
So, I mean, not just for the planet, but it's more cost effective.
Right. Another person that I'll bring up is Debbie Dooley, who's one of the co-founders of the Tea Party movement, who is also very strongly in favor of green energy. So we want to make sure that we're taking the politics out of it as best we can. We want to avoid that like the plague. Now, even if you don't believe in CO2, most people don't like to be hit in the face with a wall of smog when they open their front door.
Absolutely.
Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, most people don't like
Sure.
that.
I mean, air quality and pollution because of health
right.
is also a major thing. But you were saying that it shouldn't be political. I agree, absolutely. It should not be political. So I don't understand why it does seem to be political. And maybe it's because I'm, on the Democratic side, but I don't see why your average Republican or Republicans as a group are against this idea.
Well, one of the things that you need to look at is what the specific politicians' motivations are. Now, I would not expect Ted Cruz to flip-flop on that issue. He's the senator from Texas, or one of the two. It's the heart of oil country, so he's looking out for the oil companies.
Right.
And I do have to say that he's looking out for the people that work for those companies as well. I can certainly respect that. But once again, to put it back on the people that are forwarding the idea of man-made climate change, we need to widen the focus a little bit. It can't just be about CO2. It's got to be about air quality. It has to be about energy choice, energy independence, cost effectiveness to the consumer.
That's a good point. I mean, what you're suggesting is that people who want all these things and aren't doing a real good job of selling it.
My attitude toward that is we go after the low-hanging fruit. And if you're talking about this country, and actually a lot of other countries around the world, you can't deny that there's a lot of places where people are suffering horribly because of the air quality. That actually brings me to another question that I wanted to ask you, which is where do you see the future of the coal and petroleum industries with all this going
on? I see it fluctuating for a good number of years, where the price of fossil fuels goes up substantially, and people run to the clean energy, the solar, wind, etc. And then when that cycle hits, then the price of fossil fuels drops because there's going to be less of a need for it, and then people will go back to their Hummers, and look what Ford's doing with not producing sedans and more fuel efficient cars. They're looking to produce more trucks and
specialized
SUVs,
vehicles, in other words,
gas guzzlers more than anything. I mean, hopefully more fuel efficient than the old ones, but still they're getting away from your smaller, So I think that's going to hurt them in the long run.
I think so too, because there's always going to be a market for family cars.
Absolutely. And I think once the gas prices go up again, the fuel costs go up again, that people will be going to more electric cars and smaller vehicles, more fuel efficient in the short term. Ultimately, I expect the fossil fuel driven cars are going to go away just because they're not efficient. They're they won't be cost effective.
You know, that could very well be how things unfold. I do have to point one thing out, and this is another area where I think the people that forward the idea of man-made climate change could improve their game a little bit, which is we shouldn't be striking an adversarial relationship with petroleum companies, with coal companies, with automobile companies. The reason why I say that is because these are companies that already have very large infrastructures. If you're talking about petroleum and coal, Exxon has already talked about the breakthroughs that they've had with synthesizing biodiesel. We can't take a stance that we want to put these people out of business. And same deal with coal. One thing that is conspicuously absent in the discussion about coal is, okay, let's say coal goes away. We've still got a lot of well-trained, hardworking people that work for those companies that are going to be out of work. What do we do with them?
Well, they can go into the solar industry. I mean, they
Well,
can. They can.
I was actually just getting to that. Or they could use that engineering know-how that they have already to mine other things that would be much more in demand. And if there's a role for the government in all this, it would be to help them be repurposed.
Some of that's gone on already. I know that there are places where the coal has been stripped from the earth, where
Yeah.
they're leaving huge, big, gaping holes,
Hmm.
and to repurpose that space, that they put up solar. They've used that area
Yeah.
to put up huge solar arrays
Hmm.
and solar generating. So that area is still generating
Right.
energy, and that's something where the coal miners and the coal industry could look to do, is to
Not only
reuse that
that,
space.
but with the production of batteries, obviously lithium is going to be very much in demand.
Sure.
Now, I've never been involved in the coal industry. I have no idea what's involved in mining, but I imagine that there are some overlaps.
And all businesses, all jobs are precious. I don't want anybody to lose their job, but that does happen, and the amount of coal miners in our country is tiny.
Right.
There isn't many people mining coal anymore. Um, there, there's lots of people in the energy industry. There's lots in the oil industry. I mean, it's petroleum,
Right.
big business.
And to be fair, I think the comments that Donald Trump has made about coal have been very short-sighted. He's saying the war on coal is over with, but what's the next step? Knowing that coal is basically being priced out on the market right now.
Right.
And there's a lot of technological issues having to do with coal that simply, with the improvements in solar technology, it really is practically impossible for coal to compete on a lot of levels.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said before, I think what we need is a more holistic approach toward that wing of the industry and those people to say, okay, there is a place for you in the future of energy.
That's good.
Hmm.
Now, the problem with big oil,
Hmm.
especially, is they have a huge vested interest in maintaining the status quo, and it would be to their benefit to shift to alternative fuels as well,
Hmm.
and to phase out fossil fuels. But in the short term, maybe 5, 10, 20 years, they're making huge profits with oil. It is not in their best interests to go whole hog into solar, wind, alternative sources. It's not,
Well,
because
you're right, and but there already has been talk of how disruptive the electric car is going to be to the petroleum industry. So my thinking is that if they are wise, they're going to avoid the same mistake that American auto manufacturers made in the 1970s, which was the price of everything is going up. They're dealing with double-digit inflation, and they're still rolling cars off the assembly line that get, if they're lucky, 2 digits, as far as mileage is concerned. And the foreign automakers, especially Japan, recognized that there was a need for that, and they came in with lines and lines of well-built and very fuel-efficient cars. And the American auto industry has been paying for that lack of responsiveness ever since. So, getting back to my original point, if the petroleum and coal companies are operating operated by people that have some vision in that particular area, they need to leave the door open to the possibility that they're going to have to redesign, reinvent themselves in a very fundamental way.
That's a big if. That's a big if.
From my point of view, it is very important that we think about the business community, the people that think about those businesses. In the interest of full disclosure, one item that President Obama was very much in favor for early in his presidency was the cap and trade plan.
Mm.
I personally didn't think it was a good idea because it would be passing an unnecessary cost onto the consumer.
Mm-hmm.
So that gets into another area that I was saying before, where the people that are concerned about climate change should acknowledge that we may agree on some of the particulars, but not necessarily agree on the course of action to take.
With the cap and trade, the thing with that is it can be more representing the true cost of things. I mean, you got a company who pollutes, and they're destroying the environment. They're causing ecological damage. There's a cost to that. I mean, we've got lots of cleanup sites in this area that, and it costs billions and billions of dollars to clean up after those companies after they've dumped that. That costs people. That costs taxpayers money, or the cost on having land that's not available to use for anything else.
Mm-hmm.
That's a cost.
Right.
So when those companies were operating and dumping the stuff and not taking care of their waste products properly, they were just passing that cost on. They were cheating.
I think we should have caps on emissions. We should have environmental standards. We should have fines for companies that violate those standards. But to require companies to purchase something that's basically invented out of the air, I know you went in more detail about that. I don't want to oversimplify it because you laid it out very well. But I don't want to put ourselves in a position where we're passing on that cost directly to the consumer. If we're going to set standards, I would rather do it in such a way where we're encouraging them to switch to technologies that are proven to be much more environmentally friendly.
I think that's actually the purpose of the cap and trade system.
It is, but once again, we're requiring companies to buy these carbon credits. Why not let them? Excuse me. Why not let them keep that money and instead invest it in modernizing?
I don't disagree with you. Honestly, I don't know that cap and trade is the best system. It's one idea. It's worked some places.
And the impression I get is that from some people, mostly politicians, they seem to be of the mind that cap and trade is the only answer, and I couldn't disagree with that more.
I mean, it would be great if they just didn't produce the pollution in the first place.
It certainly would.
Don't dump into the oceans, the streams.
Well, another area where I think government can be of value is to examine those areas. I'm sure they have the data for this already that are seeing the most problems with air quality, with water quality, and just put them on notice to say we've got technology to remedy this, to make life better for the people that live in those areas, but we need you to take action.
But they're not going to do that voluntarily because it's going to cost them money.
No,
that's where
not.
the government should step in and don't put somebody in charge of the EPA who would rather see it abolished. And and it should be paid attention to when electing the next president. Who's going to look out for the people and not just the corporations that are going to be happy with not having to deal with regulations because they want to make more profits, and that helps their shareholders, and those shareholders are happy, but the people in the vicinity of that plant, they're out of luck.
Well, I've already made my own position on that clear, which is we need to hold companies accountable, but at the same time we need to do it in such a way that we're not putting jobs in danger. I'm personally excited, very excited to see renewables and their potential. I think on a lot of levels it's going to be a very good change. We do need to hold companies responsible for continuing to pollute if that's the course that they choose to go on. But we have to be conscious of the fact that people work for those companies, and it makes more sense to partner with them.
we got a little thin layer of atmosphere around our planet.
Mhm.
I think it's been described as about as thin as a veneer on a
It is very thin.
very thin.
I don't
So-
want to go off into too much of a tangent,
We-
but I think if I had to have my way, the focus of the Paris Accord would have been to help those developing countries leapfrog to the greater levels of technology, exactly as
Now, I
portrayed at the towards the end of Inconvenient Sequel, where he's Al Gore. I don't know if it's exactly as it's shown in the movie, but Al Gore's out there making phone calls, seeing what he can arrange for India, because the India Prime Minister said, "Well, yes, we're conscious of the environment, but we are a country that's trying to develop and create a better standard of living for our people.
Right.
And in order to do that, we need energy." So that's where the plan to build the 400 coal plants came from. And whether you believe in CO2 or not, all you need to do is look at what's going on right now in Delhi, India, and know that that's not a good idea
I
for
think
public health.
I agree. I think that we should help. The world should help the developing nations because it's more efficient.
Mhm.
It's sustainable.
So that's what it comes down
It's
to,
cheaper.
Jim. When I make statements like that, and then I hear statements like, well, just to make a general commentary about that, painting Republicans with a broad brush, it really makes the dialogue that much more difficult.
I'm mostly thinking of Republican politicians and not your average Republican on the street because the average Republican on the street person is much more reasonable, I think, than our politicians because their interests are having a good, healthy life, and a good, healthy planet for them and the family.
And one thing to understand about politicians is that because this issue, like so many others, has been so thoroughly politicized, it automatically force it into that 55-45 split that you see going on with so many other issues out there. And when you have a 55-45 split, give or take, it's very difficult to get anything done. And so, like I said, Al, if you're going to make a second sequel for Inconvenient Truth, just stay away from party affiliation. Go out of your way to find as many, as across as diverse a spectrum politically that you can possibly find, and put them out there front and center. Talk to those people. Get into their heads about what it is about the new technology and the new way of doing things.
I
appeal to them.
I agree, or leave party affiliation out of it completely. Do you have any other questions?
Well, you know what? I think we touched on a lot of things, and we haven't even talked about nuclear.
Yeah.
Safe nuclear.
No such thing.
Thorium.
No such
thing. We'll do another
safe.
Show on that.
No such thing as safe nuclear.
Like I said, we'll do another show on that. But for now, thank you everybody for joining us. This was our first show. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Definitely comment.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I think this was very constructive.